Hi, I'm Eve Ekman, and I am delighted to be here with Lonnie Sciotta, Mathieu Ricard, and Dacher Keltner. I'll be moderating today's discussion, exploring some of the themes that were present in the very first Destructive Emotions meeting 20 years ago. We're going to dig into what are destructive emotions? What are constructive emotions? This very foundation. We'll also look at the scientific evidence of our basic goodness. And importantly, how do we cultivate our constructive emotions for the greater good? Can we develop an altruistic intelligence that really supports our world? To start, I'll give some brief introductions of our very accomplished panelists here. Lonnie Sciotta is an associate professor of psychology at Arizona State University. She's also the director of the Substance Abuse Translational Research Network. Her research investigates positive emotions, emotion regulation, emotional processes in close relationships. We all need to know more about that. And also emotion-related mechanisms of health and behavior change. Lonnie was actually part of the team 20 years ago when Mathieu was put into the laboratory, very altruistically offering his body, mind, and heart for some of the early pioneering research on destructive emotions and what they look like with someone with many years of practice. Lonnie is passionate about making the science of emotions relatable and useful for everyday people, and how we as humans can make our way through the most important aspects of our life and relationships. Mathieu Ricard earned a PhD in molecular genetics before becoming a Buddhist monk. He has studied and practiced in Tibetan Buddhism in the Himalayas for the last 50 years. He's a humanitarian, an author, a photographer, and serves on the Mind and Life Institute board. Mathieu was really altruistic in his motivation for joining this dialogue. And as I mentioned before, he let himself be in various fMRIs, poked and prodded. He even was exposed to very loud noises. So he really understands the science, not only from the contemplative point of view, but from the first person point of view as an introspector. Spending time with Mathieu, as I've been fortunate to do, is actually all the evidence any of us could ever need to want to cultivate this curiosity, this presence, and this joy with life and sharpening of the mind. Dacher Keltner is a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley and faculty director of the Greater Good Science Center. He has published over 200 articles and 6 books, including The Power Paradox and Born to Be Good. Dacher also inspired the goodness of these studies. He himself manifests and emanates this joy of living in life, as we will see here together. Dacher also has a deep intention and care around how do we bring these practices to the areas needed most in our society today, to hospitals, to educational systems, to criminal justice work. So today we will be here together answering the call of the Dalai Lama of how can we take these ideas and understanding of destructive emotions and have them make a meaningful difference for all 7 billion people on this planet. So thank you all so much for being here. This is truly a dream come true to have you all to dig in and understand these themes and ideas together. I hope that together we can really give people a sense of not only what is the territory, but what are the antidotes that we can apply to our destructive emotions in a meaningful way? How can we really address here the important issues of our time, from racism to ecological destruction, loneliness, addiction? So good to have some high goals. We will cover all of this, and hopefully there will be some takeaways people can start using today. So we'll start with Lonnie. Our first question, Lonnie, is what have you found in your research and first-person experience of being a human being that's helped you understand the critical difference between constructive and destructive emotions?
Much, Eden. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this today. This is such a lovely and I hope helpful and meaningful endeavor. I love the way that you asked that question, because for me, the science really goes hand in hand with lived experience, and my understanding of emotions is based on the interface between those two sources of information. One thing that I've come to at this point in my life, based on both my own research, others' research, and my lived experience and a lot of personal work, is that it's not a particular emotion that is inherently destructive or constructive. It is our relationship with our emotions that has the potential to be healthy or unhealthy and destructive. I think that all emotions have a place in a rich and full life. And I don't think of any emotions as inherently good or bad, but it is how we use emotions, how we deal with our emotions, and how emotions are experienced in relation to the situations that we're in that can either be helpful or really, really problematic. And that actually gives us a lot of control when it comes down to it over developing a mature and healthy relationship with our emotions. Where I'm coming from with this is a fundamental principle in what we call affective science, which is that our emotions are not responses to objective situations. They're responses to what we think is happening in those situations and what we believe that means for us and for the things that we care about. So our emotions are responses to this layer that's happening within our own minds of interpretation of what's going on in the world. If I believe that I am loved and valued by the important people in my life, I'm going to be happy and I will feel secure, and that will give me strength to go out and do good things and treat people well. If I believe that other people, important people in my life, don't care about me, right, or that they may be trying to take advantage of me, I'm more likely to be hurt and angry. And that also is going to resonate outward in how I interact with others in my life. So our beliefs may or may not map to the actual situation. That is one aspect of health. When our beliefs are reasonably in sync with reality, there are multiple ways of looking at reality. There's no one right way, but there are greater and lesser degrees of attunement with what's actually going on in the world, in other people's minds, and within ourselves and in our relationships to others. When our beliefs about that are reasonably in tune with the situation, our emotions can be very helpful, because what they're doing is alerting us to something important about the situation and saying, you might want to take a look at this over here and deal with this situation. And when handled mindfully, it gives us an opportunity to act in ways that will hopefully improve the situation for others as well as ourselves. And when I think about it this way, there's really two ways that emotions can be destructive. The first is if they are greatly out of tune with the situation, when our biases, our mental habits, our expectations are really clouding our judgment and nudging or pulling us into emotions that really don't make sense given what's going on in the situation. That can be very, very problematic. So a healthy practice that we can have for increasing the constructiveness of our emotions is to say, do I know what's going on here? Am I sure that I understand what's happening? Am I sure that my assumptions, my interpretations of this situation are reasonable? We have the ability to identify our own biases and try to correct for them when they pop up. And this is a lot of what's going on in cognitive therapy, for example, as well as in mindfulness practice, to try to be more conscious of and attuned to those filters when they start coming in that can color how we understand what's happening in the world around us. The other way emotions can become destructive is when we give them total control over our actions. It's natural for emotions to offer a map to our situation and say, here's what might be going on, and to get us to pay attention and ask questions. It's not always a great idea to let them drive our response. And so being able to honor the emotions, recognize that they're there, listen to them, but then put in a break and go, what am I going to do about this situation that will actually help, rather than jumping to whatever instinct is pushed by those emotions, can be very, very helpful. And that can be the thing that flips emotion from destructive to constructive. It's not easy, but it's a skill that can be practiced with patience and learning. I think that anger is a really useful example of this. So there is a growing body of evidence to suggest that under some circumstances, expressed in certain ways, anger can be constructive for relationships. And over the last year in particular, at my age and being a woman of color in the world, I have actually found that acknowledging my anger can be very helpful and important for my well-being and how I communicate with others. It's a way of saying, hold on a second here. I am not being treated with the basic respect that I deserve. What is happening here is not okay. And sometimes it's actually really important to recognize that and say that when the belief is well founded, which again requires some fact checking. And when that anger is expressed honestly, respectfully, not with an attack and not with a primary intent to hurt the person you're communicating with, evidence suggests that the effects can be constructive. They can help with negotiation, they can help set boundaries and expectations, and in the long run, improve the relationship. But anger is going to be destructive when it's based upon unreasonable expectations, a sense of entitlement or inappropriate beliefs about what you deserve relative to what others deserve in those relationships, an incomplete or inaccurate understanding of the situation. And when it leads to actions that hurt other people, that are primarily focused on hurting someone else, rather than communicating your understanding of what's happening. So that's just one example, but it's one that ties together the differences between having a mature, healthy, aware relationship with both the causes and the consequences of your own emotions, and letting them fly without any processing or mindfulness.
Wow, Lonnie, thank you. It was so rich to hear just the specificity at which you brought us to an understanding of what is emotional maturity, and that how important the role of discernment is in being able to recognize and understand the causes and conditions leading to how we feel instead of they made me feel that. I really appreciate that distinction among also bringing it forth to the personal example where I think all of us can have a sense of relatability. I'd like now to ask Mathieu the very same question. So can you help us understand this fundamental difference between constructive and destructive emotions?
Well, from the Buddhist perspective, and we could also take the example of anger, maybe to illustrate at the end, it's mostly about creating suffering or creating well-being. So it's not the way it looks, but that's the criteria, because in the end, mental states who create suffering are totally undesirable. And it's so, from Buddhist perspective, it's also the foundation of ethics. It's not what is good and bad with a big J and a big, B in the sky with flaming letters. It's an embedded, in the flesh sort of ethics of what are the, outcome in terms of suffering of the greater number or for the long term and so forth. So if we take again the example of anger, which was also very dear to Paul and everyone, one of my teachers spoke about emotion, just generic name, as if you look at the big white wall painted white, it looks white, but if you look very close, you see some bumps and holes, and then some place where it's yellow and sometimes maybe a little bit dark and things like that. So it's actually a lot more nuances and textures. So just to take the example of anger, it could come from very different causes. You may just be on nerves, say I don't have many kids, but we have 30,000 kids in the school that we made, but suppose someone is on your nerve and you blow the fuse. So that's a different effect. And the antidote to look for would be more on patience and open mind and vast mind and so forth. And instead of a very narrow mind, like a firecracker in a little box. So anger could also be rightful indignation in the face of injustice and massacre. And then, of course, you need that answer. You say, this cannot be. But then the way you do it is not with hatred, it's not to harm the harm doers, but to prevent in any possible reasonable way with the less suffering possible the injustice and the harm to be done. So that's can be motivated entirely by compassion. And you may show a little bit wrathful face, but inside you should be all 100% compassionate. And then, as Danny mentioned, there's the anger that's motivated with harming. And even though you you might say, well, but probably you will agree on that, that there's nothing good to be found in hatred. And this is a form of anger, and their hatred, it's our arch enemy in a way. And so it has been doing wrong to everyone so many times, so many places, in so many fields of lives. So in that sense, a destructive emotion is the one the outcome is clearly suffering for others and also for oneself. We are in the loop, in fact. People who are in the pangs of hatred, it's hard to say that they find any peace within. They don't feel attuned with the basic goodness. There's something that we always say afterwards, I was out of myself, which is a nice image. No more yourself. I was no more myself after you blow the fuse. So you ask forgiveness, I was no more myself. So that means yourself is somehow, and when you do an act of generosity, of kindness, even nobody knows about it, you feel good. So of course, some people who are absolutely dead on proving selfishness, universal selfishness, we say, oh, the warm glow, you are selfish because you feel good about it. But of course, you won't feel good if you just do that nominally, but if you don't actually have a really, warm heart behind. So without warm heart, there's no warm glow. So anyway, I think that will be the main distinction, is and the outcome also comes from the intention. So, well, when it's action, you cannot look at the way it looks like. You could, be all smiles and do something terribly nice to someone with the idea of picking his pocket. That's why you want to approach the person. If you want to be a pickpocket, you don't want to approach it in an aggressive way. Or you could push violently a child, and the child might fall and maybe break its arm, but you save the life of the child if he's about to be run over by a car. So it looks violent, but it's not. So action, we can't look. Emotion, you could look, especially because the way it's expressed in action and words, but really to look at the root of making it constructive or destructive is your emotion. Is your emotion chiefly to bring, does it feel like you want to, it comes out with wanting to bring something good to the others or to harm others? Is it in the short term or the long term? Is it for the smaller number or the greater number? So this somehow how we could distinguish, I guess.
Thank you, Mathieu. I really appreciate you highlighting this connection between our motivation and our action, right? And that fundamental piece that underlies whether the way that we respond and react can actually be something helpful or harmful, sometimes difficult to parse from the outside.
There's an image, if I may ask,
Please.
if I may add, when there's a crystal, and if you put it on the blue cloth, it becomes all blue. If you put it on the red cloth, it becomes all red. So the motivation colors everything else, all our mental state.
And how we get our mind to be like that crystal, we will address as well. I think you mentioned here too, the one antidote. I want to kind of highlight our antidotes, our tools. And one thing you're mentioning is that really cultivating this compassionate mind. And
well, antidote are specific. Again, it's patience for if you blow the fuse. If it's a harmful thought, it's cultivating loving kindness and benevolence and altruism. And indignation, well, you don't need really an antidote if it's precisely the right amount of it at the right time, the right circumstances. So what Aristotle and you say, Lani, it should be the right amount at the right intensity for the right duration. So indignation basically doesn't need antidote if it's properly, honed and harnessed.
Yeah, it's. I think we would have far less people sign up for a patience workshop than a compassion workshop. But what I'm hearing from you is, if we really want to cultivate the antidote to some of our forms of anger, that patience is the training that would be most supportive to us.
Well, to one kind of but loving kindness will be for hatred. And again, we may say emotions are not intrinsically harmful, but again, you mentioned about the seminar, but say you offer a weekend where we guarantee that you will be 100% more jealous at the end or 100% more arrogant. And basically, I don't know who you will get except a few French guys. So there's something there that some of them are not quite, you don't want them to be too overwhelming, or even, you feel better if they are not too much present in your mind stream.
Yeah. 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 And I think that's a great segue for asking Dacker, yet another turn of this question, this idea of the trainability of our constructive or destructive emotions. I know this has been such a huge part of your life's work. Can you tell us about constructive and destructive emotions and maybe this aspect of what can be shifted, changed, or improved?
Yeah, I mean, in the last 20 years since destructive emotions, the science of emotion has changed dramatically, thanks to people like Lonnie, who's with us today, and many others around the world. We have mapped a really fascinating space of constructive emotions that, compassion, awe, gratitude, love, contentment. There's remarkable work on that, laughter. So I think we have a much richer understanding of what the constructive emotions are, all the way down to genes and neurophysiology and things like the vagus nerve with respect to compassion. We've also learned a lot about the deep evolutionary roots of these states, that we do not survive as a species, as Charles Darwin argued, if we don't take care of vulnerable people, vulnerable individuals. And so what Darwin was arguing is that the principle of no harm and elevating well-being is maybe the deepest evolutionary principle guiding the design of who we are and what our minds are meant to do. We've been doing a lot of work on awe and wonder, which people like Rachel Carson and Albert Einstein and Toni Morrison feel is the foundation of the human imagination. And you can trace those back to the first moments of life, even Jane Goodall felt in chimpanzees. These are the constructive emotions, I think, are our deepest evolutionary heritage. And I actually got to that, I just have to say, on a personal note. I was on a panel, I was hanging around Mathieu. We were I think it was at MIT, I don't know, 18 or 20 years ago, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we were all sitting there as scientists this 20 years ago, and he's like, compassion is the natural state of the mind. And I was like, what? I was steeped in the fight or flight tradition of emotions and destruction, and it opened my eyes. So how do we cultivate? And I think, there are now thousands of studies, the mindfulness tradition, the compassion tradition, the loving kindness tradition, the gratitude tradition. There are hundreds of studies in South Korea and Japan that aren't making their way into English on the benefits of being in nature. And they all converge on how readily cultivatable these states are, these constructive states. They shift our cortisol levels, our vagal tone, brain patterns, gene expression. So I think we know this, and it's one of the most important things we should be thinking about with respect to the science.
Thank you.
Can I add one small thing about that?
Of course.
No, thank you, Dacker, because I did a photo book on wonder. I call it Wonderment in French, but it's only in French, but the photos are there. And then when I look a little bit to put some science, I found your papers on orb, and one of them showed that you are more altruistic. I went, bingo, yeah. And the Japanese paper on the walking in the forest was amazing that it didn't do the same effect whether they were pine trees or different other kind of deciduous trees. One was calming down and one was giving you more. It is quite mind-boggling, all these biophilia studies. Really wonderful.
Send me the book.
Yeah, I will send you the PDF in French. You don't need the text, but
please.
Yeah. And I think this is a nice transition now, Mathieu. The next question will start with you. And this is really around the cultivation of wholesome mental states. So we've talked about awe, a little bit about compassion. And of course, this is important that we know the science. Thousands of years of contemplative practice have demonstrated the benefit for ourselves and for others. And yet there can be a way these practices are just self-serving, only for our own well-being. And you have written and spoken and demonstrated through how you live your life, altruism. So how can we really make sure these practices help us uncover or reveal altruism instead of maybe isolating us further and in some ways just anesthetizing our stress or our pain?
Well, first of all, I find amazing that we are still, I mean, anyone could question that, basic human qualities didn't need to be trained, that we will be right at the top from the beginning. Like, it's contrary to everything we know. We're never born, but knowing how to read and write and play ping pong and anything like that. Everything was trained and practiced. So that's already, I remember a breakfast on the future of happiness at Davos Economic Forum. And I spoke about this trainability of emotion. And, there's all these big shots. And one of them came at the end and said, it's very new that you can train your emotions, something like that. So I said, wow, there's a lot of work to do. Anyway, I think what you said, it would be really take a big shot to go wrong on loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy, and impartiality to make it self-serving, narcissistic. I mean, that takes a big way. But if you look certainly for so-called well-being or happiness or flourishing, there you could go wrong in a big way. And not only the Buddhists, but Romain Rolland said, if selfish happiness is the only goal of your life will soon be goalless. It makes you miserable from morning till evening, me all day long, very small space. It's kind of stuffy in that self-ego sort of bubble. And you make everyone's life miserable because you are either instrumentalizing them or seeing them as a threat. So there's huge gap between self and others. So no interconnection, no view of interdependence. So yes, if you look for that and use whatever, psychology, self-help, or anything like that, in that perspective, then no, it's not going to do any good. But altruism, it's hard to see how you could make it self-serving, except again, if you believe in this universal selfishness and you say, well, the warm glow is just another way to please yourself. I mean, I met people like that. I was once in a panel in France with a big philanthropist who was a banker, and he said, I just do that because I feel so good. So, well, it's already nice if he does it and it feels good, but it's not genuine altruism. Altruism, as Daniel Batson has said, is the motivation is to bring good to others. And as a bonus, you might get also a great satisfaction. I mean, why should you feel terrible after doing something wonderful to someone? I mean, that's the wrong debate, that you should be a sacrifice, that you could suffer, otherwise it's not altruistic. This is very strange. So, and I would argue actually that it's a really wrong argument to say the warm glow show is kind of self-serving selfishness. It's like asking a flame to light, but not to emit warm. I mean, those two goes together. I mean, if you really a good heart, you will also feel good. It's like a bonus. It comes on top of it. And so it's a win-win situation. And if you are deadly selfish and only, instrumentalize everything around yourself, then you will not feel good and you make others unhappy. It's a lose-lose situation, doesn't work. And also, it's not only the subjective experience, it also doesn't work because it's not attuned to reality. Reality is interdependent. Nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, may I suffer the whole day. It doesn't take rocket science to transport yourself in someone's mind. And even we are confused and maybe addicted to the cause of suffering, but deep within somehow, there's something at the very bottom that, okay, it would be somehow better if I didn't suffer. So if we recognize that common, I don't say sentience or humanity or aspiration, then we can look, what is the best way? What should I do and not do to myself flourish? What should I do to others and not do to others that will cause suffering or happiness? So then things comes into place. So if it is, and you can check whether it's genuine altruism, compassion, sympathetic joy, and so forth, and then I think it cannot go wrong. And sympathetic joy, once I was talking with Dan Batson, I said, it's a very altruistic thing. He said, why? Because, nobody is going to blame you if you don't rejoice in Gandhi's work. Nobody is going to expect that you do that. So it's a way of participating beautifully in the, compassionate action of someone, and opens your mind to altruism, to connectedness. So yes, all those are only make sense if they are altruistic. But there are many things that can be used for self-serving purpose, but not, I think, altruistic love and compassion.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Mathieu. And I think what you're highlighting too is if we pay close attention to what it feels like when we are acting kindly, when we witness kindness, that we naturally sense, yeah, maybe it's the experience of feeling good, feeling connected, feeling the naturalness of that. And, I think some of the concerns that I see in the field of psychology greater, and we'll move to Lonnie for this question, is it possible to kind of overemphasize personal well-being and in some ways forget or put secondary collective or communal well-being? So yeah, Lonnie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. And I really resonated with everything that Matu shared. I have really two thoughts that came up during that exchange. The first is that there is a reason why we may tend to focus a little more automatically on negative things going on in our environment, right? So there's a pretty rich body of research suggesting that humans have what's called a negativity bias, that problems in our environment grab our attention quickly and tend to hold it, and also impinge on our memory, right? That our memories form of events and stimuli that have proved dangerous or problematic or to make us sick or to cause pain in any way. So we do have that, and we have it for a reason, because again, those events are important for us. But because of that, it's helpful to make sure that we don't get stuck there, and to practice paying attention to the beauty, the benefits, the positive relationships, the good thing in our lives. And there's evidence to suggest that even when we're in a very painful, difficult, stressful situation, the ability to take the time and notice good things in our environment, so we can change the focus away from pain for a minute, or find a silver lining in a difficult situation, so that we can say, yeah, this is really bad, but look, in the long run, there's this good thing that will probably come out of it that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Those two emotion regulation skill sets actually predict better well-being. We have some evidence from my lab that in late spring, during the early months of the coronavirus pandemic, when a lot of people were still in lockdown, people who were able to do that were actually better off psychologically. They experienced less depression, less stress, more positive emotion, and healthier relationships. That's preliminary data right now, but that's one of the things that we're starting to see already in that very difficult situation. The other thought that I had is that we have this mantra in our society that the only thing that matters is that you're happy. And that makes me very nervous, because I study positive emotion. I value joy. I thrive on all of the pleasure that our emotions can bring. But happiness is not the only thing that matters. Personal happiness is certainly not the only thing that matters. And when I think about the people I know who placed their bets in life on moment-to-moment enjoyment and fun and pleasure as the sense of their sense of well-being, as the center of what's meaningful to them, those people are not very happy. And there is some recent evidence suggesting that people who place the greatest value on experiencing moment-to-moment happiness and believe that without that moment-to-moment personal emotional pleasure, that without that things aren't going to be okay, those people are actually pretty upset because it's an unrealistic expectation. And to the extent that it's possible, you can only fulfill it by causing future damage in your life, or prioritizing your needs and well-being over the needs and well-being of the people around you. And that ends up being destructive and reverting back to you for all of the reasons that Matu talked about. So I think we really need to get away from this, my happiness or your happiness is the only thing that matters, and move a little bit toward, you know what, the well-being of all us as a community is the thing that matters and the thing to work toward. And that ultimately, that eudaimonic happiness, is much richer and more fulfilling in the long run.
Wow. Yeah, so provoking and helpful, I'd say, to confront this idea of well-being being conflated with happiness, and that happiness being sensory enjoyment. And I am so delighted. I am so happy that well-being seems to be in front of almost everything offered in our society these days. It is such a step in the right direction. It addresses a lot of the lack. And yet, as you're pointing out, it can inadvertently thwart the very best efforts. So this is a wonderful tee up for Dacker, who a course on happiness that he has been leading for years online and in person and has attracted millions. And what is it that you are imparting to these individuals about what do they need to know in terms of their own well-being and our collective well-being for the greater good?
Well, I think it's a profoundly important time to be asking this question and questioning it and problematizing it. In particular in the United States, historic levels of economic inequality, mass incarceration, white supremacy has resurfaced. It's always been there. And our young people whom I teach are struggling. The data are pretty clear. And I think that the reason that they're struggling is what's surfaced with Mathieu and Lonnie's comments, which is they've been misguided on the path to happiness in some sense by our culture. They are told that it is, and this is sort of what you might expect, but it's true, which is that it comes through materialism and rising in the ranks, and then it produces and self-focus, and that's all well documented. And what we teach, in our kind of greater good version of happiness is an alternative, which is it's found in states that we evolved to serve other people, like compassion and awe and gratitude as foundational. It is found in casting aside the illusion that we are a separate self. And, the science on that is astonishing that, of James Fowler, Nicholas Christakis, new work on musical appreciation. I am feeling the emotions of people around me that I met yesterday. And those emotions are being transmitted to other people. And then it is found in, a word that third pathway that we teach in the greater good version is discernment. Is like, we all get hit with hard things in life. People you love die. You will not succeed at things you really care for, etc. That's life. First noble truth of Buddhism, and that's okay. Put it in a context. So I think the conversation that we're trying, we're moving toward is, let's think together about these new states of wonder that Mathieu is recording and on, that Lonnie studied in compassion. Let's start to think about returning to those communal roots and teach people these tools of handling hard things. So, and it's been, Lonnie put it right, which is our misconception about happiness is, it's just about, it's inside me, it's in pleasure. It's that is a little tiny piece of it, and it's a much bigger story that we should be engaging in.
Mathieu, any thoughts after?
Yeah, well,
Please.
so many. I mean, Aristotle said it's the goal of goals. Dalai Lama said also it's one of the main goals. But of course, if you look in the wrong place and you don't know what you are looking for, then it's a problem. And then that's why, as Lenny said, if you think that happiness is an endless succession of pleasant experience, first it's a recipe for exhaustion, and then you are really in a bad start, because the pleasure has nothing wrong, to take a hot shower after walking in the snow, that's great. But imagine 24 hours in the hot shower, or the best music, and then 24 hours of best music. They use it at Guantanamo to torture people. So pleasure change, become neutral, become aversive. It can be very selfishly experienced. I mean, it's completely different. It's nothing wrong, but it's different. It can sometimes help towards flourishing and well-being and eudaimonia, as you said. So it's really the confusion between hedonism and eudaimonia.
Yeah.
So now if we see happiness and, for instance, sadness from our perspective of eudaimonia and what Buddhists call sukha, as happiness as a way of being. That is a cluster of fundamental human qualities like altruism, inner peace, inner resilience, inner freedom, sense of interconnectedness, many different qualities that come together that can be cultivated separately as skills, not just happiness. And then as a way of being, the more you actually experience, the stronger and the deeper they grow, instead opposite of pleasure that exhausts itself. And Sadness is not pleasant, but it's completely legitimate if you lost someone or if you see something terrible, a lot of suffering. But it's not incompatible with the sense of direction in life. It's not compatible with courage. It's not incompatible with compassion. So it's not incompatible with this sense of, deep sense of fulfillment that comes with happiness as a way of being or well-being. The word well-being, if it didn't have the hyphen and if it was not so overused, that would be better, to be well in the deepest of your being. And it's a trend that in France, bien-être is it's like comfort, but mal-être is very deep, like the ill being. It's like you are the rock bottom of despair and existential. You don't want to live anymore. But well-being in French is very light. So we don't have ill-being that much in English, but well-being is well-being, being well in the depth of your being, being in harmony with yourself and others. So then that can be also cultivated as skills, unlike pleasure. And even joy is the kind of the natural expression of eudaimonia in some occasions, not always. But you jump off joy, you don't jump off eudaimonia. And if you give an image, it's like the spring blossom of sense of fulfillment, but it doesn't have to be there all the time. I mean, you could be sad and still have retain this very powerful inner freedom, the depth of wisdom and compassion. So yes, so it's a vast subject. And if, the French philosopher Henri Bergson said, everyone left happiness in the vague so that they could define in their own terms. But then it's like shooting arrows in the dark. And I heard someone say, for me, happiness is a good plate of spaghetti. Okay, then what to do? I mean, so you have to define it properly, and then it can be constructed in a way. And some people are very opposite to that. They say, oh, no, perpetual construction of yourself is very boring. It should be magic moments. But if you look at the magic moment, what it is, walking under the stars in the snow, what? Sense of connectedness, inner peace. You don't have inner conflicts. So there are elements of that you can identify, and you can bring them to the optimal sort of level. So this is not actually a complete mixture, those magic moments.
Yeah, and I think you're also highlighting, if we can distinguish and identify what are the true causes and conditions of our happiness, instead of I want to be happy, bring that to me. This idea of actually maybe I have a role in trying to understand and uncover. And this brings us well to the question that Dacher will kick off. And you've already mentioned a bit of this today, but there's an idea, fundamental in Buddhism, of our basic goodness. This idea that we are actually always already okay. And if you take that even one step further, we're actually always already what it is we are looking for. Maybe that happiness is here, not on the outside. And I think the first place that I'm speaking about, maybe our basic goodness, that has a bit more evidence. This idea that we could be happy just as we are, irrespective of outside circumstances, maybe a little less so. So I'd be curious to hear from you, Dacher, not only about this idea, but how might that idea of our basic goodness help us face or meet the challenges of our world today?
Well, I think, a couple of quick thoughts. The science on basic goodness to me is astonishing, and I think it is revolutionary the past 25 years. You give people the chance to share resources in about 40 different cultures around the world of every kind. They don't have to share much. They share 40 to 50% with a stranger. We just have a default to share. The neurophysiology on compassion, from old regions of the brain that help us care for others, to the vagus nerve, to oxytocin, is really, just it's down in our cells. So goodness is there. I think it can help us in a couple of important ways. One is how we rethink the problems of our world. We have 2 million people in prison in the United States. A third of, they suffer from mental health issues. And we've built a system that presupposes that those are bad seeds of society and can't be reformed. You know, we have the most punitive laws in the industrialized world outside of, I think, South Africa. So, you know, that if that system was built up around a different view of those people, those human beings, it would be a much different system. And there's a lot of work on how we punish people really stems from our conception of goodness and badness. I think it also relates to the broader quest of happiness that we've been talking about together. And, you know, where do we find it? How do we have to hop on a plane to find it? Do we have to buy things to find it? Do we need the most expensive meal? And the answer is no, that it's really close by. It's in, you know, giving a hug to Matthew when you bump into him in a part of the world, or sharing ideas with Lonnie, and you know, it's in these old simple things. So I hope, you know, our sort of sense of, at least in the United States, of what our culture should be was grounded in one version of human nature, of Homo economicus. And that model of human nature has failed scientifically. And I think it's time for a different model to kind of guide these questions.
Thank you, Dacker. Yeah, and Lonnie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this similar thread here of what does it mean to understand that possibly, especially these destructive emotions that some of us over-identify with. You know, I'm an angry person. I'm a jealous person. You know, these ideas that we get stuck on, and it means that, of course, whatever is good couldn't be in here. It's got to be out there. Like, how do we work with this view of who we are as possibly fundamentally good, and what might that mean or look like in how we interact with society and the problems of our world?
Such a great question. And I have to start by saying Dacker's point is so important, and the work that Dacker, that you've been doing to take that evidence, which is really very rich, and get it out there so that people are aware of it, is so, so, so important. You know, I'm actually in a field called evolutionary psychology that people often assume lies in underscoring the worst about us and making excuses for our violence and our anger and our group differences and all these things. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. Margaret Mead was once asked what was the first piece of evidence of civilization, and her answer was a healed femur, a healed thigh bone. And he said, what? And she said, no other animal on earth will take care of someone who is injured and keep them alive and protect them until they have time for that injury to heal. Only humans. And as Dacker has said, the evidence that this is really a default setting, possibly even such a default setting that we're not aware of it a lot of the time, that the first mandate is to care for others, do no harm, resonate positively in a compassionate way toward others, is very powerful. Now, I talked earlier about the negativity bias that we have. And so in some ways, precisely because that baseline is such a constant, we're unaware that it's happening, the negatives that we hear about may be much more salient and actually capture our attention to a greater extent. Part of what we need to be doing is counteracting the intensity of that negativity bias. I think one of the problems that we're facing as a society right now is how easy it is to assume that other people's motives are hostile, that they bear us and people like us ill will, that they pose us a threat. Yeah. I think you can root a lot of the hatred that Matthew spoke of earlier, a lot of the anger, a lot of the violence that we're experiencing as a society in that belief. We could go a long way by assuming as a default that whoever we're speaking with and whoever we're thinking about probably believes that what they are doing and saying and thinking, they are doing with the goal of protecting and caring for someone who is real to them. And that anyone that gets hurt along the way is not quite completely real in their own minds. And I say that not punitively. I say that because they have not experienced the reality of those others that they are harming. Were they to do so, you might be dealing with a very different situation. We all have very different lived experiences and people and situations to whom we are exposed and have the opportunity to form that vivid lived reality of someone else's experience and perspective as well as my own. I have found it in our current world helpful and constructive when talking with people with whom I disagree, as well as those with whom I agree, to start from a place of, I'm going to assume you're not a horrible person. I'm going to assume that nobody's inherently a horrible person and ask if we disagree even deeply about the reality of some situation and what's okay and who's doing what and who's a good person, who's a bad person, all those things, that it comes from some fundamental difference in the way that we're looking at this situation, not that you are bad or hostile, but because you are looking out for somebody who's different from who I'm looking out for. And maybe we need to think about looking at all of those people. I love, if I can bring Disney into it for a moment. I don't know if anyone's seen Moana, but there is this line from Moana that, as someone who from a Hawaiian cultural background, I just love, which is Ohana means family, and family means nobody gets left behind. And if we can think of everybody in our world as family in that way and say, ho, we need to have this conversation in such a way that everybody is heard, nobody gets left behind, and we presume somewhere a seed of goodness in everyone that we interact with, while being careful and while calling people on their issues when we see them, and feeling free to disagree respectfully and honestly, I think we might have much healthier conversations as a society.
Thank you for sharing that very caring and clear vision of how we can hold one another. I love this idea of Ohana. I've heard that word and I loved the movie. And I like that as a metaphor for us. What would it take for us to all be family? Mathieu, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this basic.
Yeah, well, big subject, wonderful subject. So yes, so first of all, Hannah Arendt spoke of the banality of evil, but I love the banality of goodness, which is much more a fact of life.
Yeah.
Is that most of the time, most of 7 billion human beings behave decently to each other. And that's why we don't notice it, because that's the way it is. And nobody is congratulating themselves that after a train ride or a plane ride, or you go to the theater and you say, oh, nobody had a fight tonight. It's normal. If two people pick up a fight, especially listening to a conference on altruism, you say, well, this guy, So it's shocking, and that's why we pay attention. And as you mentioned about evolution, if you look at the many work like Martin Nowak and others, cooperation has been much more creative to get to higher levels of evolution and competition that it is there, but we forget about that. If you look at the work of Warneken and Tomasello on young children, of course, we can become psychopaths, but basically we have a stronger disposition to cooperate, to help, and so forth. So all that is more like, the baseline and the way we should behave. And even you mentioned about animals, yes, possibly, but I have also examples of two dolphins taking turns to keep one another alive or afloat for 3 days while healing so that it could breed. So anyway, those things are there also a different extent. But I just want to bring briefly the Buddhist perspective, is that we believe that somehow consciousness is a kind of space, say we call the luminous aspect of consciousness is the faculty to know, compared to an opaque object that doesn't know anything, zero cognitive faculty. So if you think of the example of light, which is a good example, it doesn't mean it shines in the dark, the consciousness, but a beam of light, it can light up a heap of garbage, doesn't become dirty. It lights up a heap of gold, doesn't become expensive. So the basic quality of consciousness is just to know. So then the rest is the content, which just fills up the mental landscape, mental constructions. And there are all many causes and conditions can make that go to sort of harmful thoughts, compassionate thoughts. So that's all the mental landscape. If it was somehow a basic evil, that means if we look deep within that basic consciousness, as sometimes meditators do, you will find somewhere hatred here and there, the basic jealousies are sitting there just waiting to explode. But in fact, if you look at your mind, looking at the big sky, you don't see that. You see more that they come one thought, two thoughts, then they go 1,000 thoughts, and then you get upset, and then you get really enraged. But those mental constructs. And so it's much closer to the natural state is to rest in that luminosity, if you could say, that simplicity, that clear awareness, open presence that we call sometimes. And then what will come out of it naturally will be more like compassion, loving kindness than hatred and so forth. Those are more peripheral after a lot of mental construct. Why me? Why not me? And then build up on that. So anyway, there's so much to say, but somehow in a nutshell, when you somehow look deep within, you are the beautiful environment, the biophilia, the wonderment. If you look within, usually you will find more sort of this freedom, peaceful, more compassionate. And when you get caught into automatic chain reaction of thought, then all those buildups, resentment, jealousy, arrogance, harmful thoughts and so forth. So anyway, maybe it's naive way of thinking, but it's also observational, because contemplative somehow, when they go deep within, they don't really find hatred, they found this space of open presence. So I like to believe that this is more our natural state, basic goodness.
What a beautiful way for us to bring this conversation to its close. This idea that our natural state could be luminous, could be in and of itself good, and that when we find even glimpses of that, compassion naturally arises, kindness is there. I think that's a very encouraging message. And my hope for everyone listening is that this helps uplift an idea of our natural state and also gives us a bit of encouragement to pay close attention. Notice that negativity bias. Notice when it's possible to enact or engage with anger in a wholesome, skillful way. And notice especially, what is it like to feel and receive kindness? What is it like to extend kindness? Can we bring a kindness consciousness in a way that really helps this world feel more naturally as it is, one in which we have these predispositions? Hopefully this will allow us to do the difficult work we need to do in our hospital systems, in our school systems, in our criminal justice systems throughout the world. We aren't saying we're all kind, so now we don't have to do any more work. I think everyone here would agree that this kindness, it's a buoy. It'll help us, and yet there is so much work to do. But that work is too exhausting if we feel we're just battling the bad. We're up against the hatred of the world. Let's, as Lonnie invited us, and Mathieu and Dacher, let's see and consider the goodness that's all around us, and let that be the motivation for the important work we need to do moving ahead. Thank you all so much. Such a delight to be together.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eve.
Everyone. So
Such a
nice to
great
see you.
conversation.
Thank you.